The Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was a global catastrophe that reshaped societies, destroyed fortunes, collapsed governments, and permanently changed how the world understands money, markets, and human behavior. Beginning in 1929 and lasting throughout the 1930s, the Great Depression plunged millions into poverty, erased decades of economic progress, and exposed the fragile foundations of the global financial system. Factories shut down, banks collapsed overnight, and unemployment reached levels never seen before. For ordinary people, it meant hunger, homelessness, and despair. For governments, it was a brutal lesson in economic mismanagement and unchecked speculation. Before the crash, the world believed prosperity was permanent. The 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties, a decade of booming industry, rising stock markets, and widespread optimism. People invested in stocks with borrowed money, banks lent recklessly, and governments believed markets could regulate themselves. Very few imagined that this illusion of endless growth could vanish almost overnight. Yet in October 1929, when the stock market collapsed, the economic system unraveled with terrifying speed. What followed was not a short recession, but a decade-long depression that affected nearly every country on Earth. The Great Depression changed everything. It transformed capitalism, gave rise to government intervention in economies, reshaped political ideologies, and set the stage for World War II. It taught painful lessons about inequality, speculation, and the dangers of unregulated markets. Even today, economists, policymakers, and investors study the Great Depression to understand how economic disasters begin and how they can be prevented. To understand the modern world, one must first understand the Great Depression. To understand why the Great Depression happened, we must first understand the decade that came before it. The 1920s were a time of extraordinary economic growth, especially in the United States. Factories produced cars, radios, refrigerators, and consumer goods at record levels. New technologies transformed daily life, and cities expanded rapidly. Credit became easily available, allowing ordinary people to buy goods they could not afford up front. This expansion created the belief that prosperity was permanent and unstoppable. Stock markets became the symbol of this new wealth. Millions of Americans invested in stocks, many for the first time in their lives. Newspapers reported daily market gains, and stockbrokers promised quick riches. People borrowed money to invest, buying stocks on margin, meaning they only paid a small portion up front while borrowing the rest. As long as stock prices rose, this system appeared safe. But in reality, it created a massive financial bubble fueled by speculation rather than real economic value. Beneath the surface, serious problems were already forming. Wealth was unevenly distributed, with a small percentage of people controlling most of the income. Farmers struggled with low crop prices, factories overproduced goods that people could not afford, and wages failed to keep up with productivity. While stock prices soared, the real economy was weaker than it appeared. The prosperity of the 1920s was built on debt, speculation, and fragile confidence conditions that made the system extremely vulnerable to collapse. Governments and financial institutions failed to recognize these warning signs. Regulations were minimal, banks operated with little oversight, and there was blind faith in the free market. Many believed economic cycles were a thing of the past. This dangerous optimism created the perfect environment for disaster. When confidence finally broke, the entire system collapsed under its own weight. The stock market crash of 1929 did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded over weeks of panic, fear, and confusion. In late October, investors began selling stocks in massive numbers as prices started to fall. On October 24th, known as Black Thursday, millions of shares were sold in a frantic attempt to escape losses. Banks and major investors briefly intervened, temporarily stabilizing the market. But the damage was already done. Confidence was shattered. Just days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday, the market collapsed completely. Stock prices plunged beyond recovery, wiping out billions of dollars in wealth in a single day. Investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks were ruined overnight. Banks that had invested heavily in the market collapsed as well. Ordinary people lost their life savings, and the shock spread rapidly through the economy. The crash itself did not cause the Great Depression, but it acted as the trigger that exposed deeper weaknesses. As banks failed, credit disappeared. Businesses could no longer borrow money to operate, forcing mass layoffs. Consumers stopped spending, fearing for their future. This decline in demand led to further business closures, creating a vicious cycle of unemployment and poverty. What began as a financial crisis quickly became a social and humanitarian disaster. Fear became contagious. People rushed to withdraw their savings from banks, causing bank runs that accelerated the collapse of the financial system. With no deposit insurance and little government protection, once a bank failed, depositors lost everything. The stock market crash destroyed confidence not just in markets, but in the entire economic system. Trust, the foundation of any economy, had vanished. As banks collapsed and businesses shut their doors, the true human cost of the Great Depression became painfully visible. Unemployment rose at a speed the world had never witnessed before. By the early 1930s, nearly 1 out of every 4 workers in the United States was unemployed. In industrial cities, factories that once roared with machinery fell silent. Men and women who had worked their entire lives suddenly found themselves without jobs, without savings, and without hope. The loss of income was not just an economic shock, it was a psychological and emotional trauma that shattered families and communities. For millions, daily life became a struggle for survival. Breadlines stretched across city blocks as charities and churches struggled to feed the hungry. Soup kitchens became lifelines, offering thin meals to desperate crowds. Families were evicted from their homes when they could no longer pay rent or mortgages. Entire neighborhoods of makeshift shelters known as Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up on the outskirts of cities. These shantytowns, built from scrap wood, cardboard, and metal, symbolized the collapse of the American dream. What had once been a nation of optimism became a land of uncertainty and fear. The Depression hit farmers especially hard. Years of overproduction had already lowered crop prices, and the economic collapse pushed rural communities into crisis. Many farmers lost their land when they could not repay loans. The situation was worsened by natural disasters like the Dust Bowl, where drought and poor farming practices turned fertile land into barren dust. Massive dust storms destroyed crops, forced families to abandon their farms, and triggered mass migration. Thousands packed their belongings and traveled west in search of work, only to face exploitation, poverty, and rejection. The image of displaced families wandering in search of survival became one of the most haunting symbols of the Great Depression. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical hardship. Men who could no longer provide for their families experienced deep shame and loss of identity. Suicide rates increased, mental health deteriorated, and despair spread silently through society. Children dropped out of school to help support their families, sacrificing education for survival. The social fabric of communities began to unravel as fear, competition for scarce jobs, and uncertainty replaced trust and stability. The Great Depression was no longer just an economic event, it was a human tragedy on a massive scale. This widespread suffering revealed a harsh truth. When an economic system collapses, it is ordinary people who pay the highest price. The Great Depression exposed the absence of social safety nets and the dangers of leaving millions vulnerable to forces beyond their control. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, inequality, and the role of government in protecting its citizens. The pain endured during these years would ultimately push nations to rethink their economic systems. but only after unimaginable hardship. Although the Great Depression began in the United States, its impact quickly spread across the world, turning a national crisis into a global catastrophe. By the late 1920s, the global economy was deeply interconnected. European nations depended on American loans, international trade linked continents, and financial markets were tied together by fragile confidence. When the U.S. economy collapsed, it pulled the rest of the world down with it. Capital flowed out of Europe, trade collapsed, and economies that were already weakened by World War I fell into deep depression. Europe was hit especially hard. Countries like Germany and Austria relied heavily on American loans to rebuild after the war. When U.S. banks recalled these loans, European financial systems collapsed almost instantly. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment surged. Germany, already struggling with political instability and economic hardship, faced mass poverty and social unrest. Inflation, followed by deflation, destroyed savings and livelihoods. The Depression did not just damage economies, it destabilized entire political systems, creating fertile ground for extremism and authoritarian movements. Global trade collapsed at an unprecedented rate. As demand fell, countries attempted to protect their own economies by raising tariffs and restricting imports. These protectionist policies, especially the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the United States, made the situation far worse. International trade shrank by more than half, cutting off income for exporting nations and deepening the global downturn. Instead of recovery, nations entered a destructive cycle where each tried to save itself at the expense of others, proving that economic isolation could not solve a global crisis. In Asia, Latin America, and Africa, the Depression was equally devastating. Countries dependent on exporting raw materials, such as coffee, rubber, oil, and minerals, saw prices collapse. Government revenues vanished, public services deteriorated, and poverty spread rapidly. In many regions, the Depression reinforced colonial exploitation, as imperial powers prioritized their own survival over the welfare of colonized populations. The crisis revealed the deep inequalities built into the global economic system, where weaker economies bore the greatest burden. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had become a worldwide disaster, affecting nearly every nation. No economy was immune, and no society escaped unscarred. The crisis exposed the dangers of economic interdependence without cooperation, showing that financial collapse in one region could destabilize the entire world. The global nature of the Depression forced governments to confront a new reality. Economic problems could no longer be solved within national borders alone. The world had entered an era where cooperation or its absence could determine the fate of millions. When the Great Depression deepened, millions looked to their government for relief. But what they received instead was hesitation, delay, and misplaced faith in outdated economic ideas. President Herbert Hoover entered office believing strongly in limited government intervention. He argued that markets would naturally correct themselves, and that direct aid to citizens would weaken individual responsibility. This belief, rooted in earlier American traditions, proved disastrous in the face of an economic collapse of unprecedented scale. As unemployment soared and banks failed, the government's response appeared slow, detached, and painfully inadequate. Hoover initially relied on voluntary cooperation between businesses, urging companies not to cut wages or lay off workers. But these appeals had little effect. Businesses facing collapse had no choice but to shut down or reduce operations. Hoover also supported limited public works projects, such as the Hoover Dam, believing infrastructure spending would stimulate employment. However, these efforts were too small and too slow to counter the massive economic freefall. For ordinary citizens standing in breadlines or living in shantytowns, government action felt distant and symbolic rather than meaningful. Perhaps the most damaging failure was the government's handling of the banking crisis. Instead of aggressively stabilizing the financial system, authorities allowed thousands of banks to fail. Each collapse destroyed public confidence further, accelerating the downward spiral. Hoover resisted direct federal aid to banks and individuals, fearing it would undermine capitalism itself. Ironically, this refusal to intervene nearly destroyed the very system he was trying to protect. By the early 1930s, trust in both banks and government had collapsed. Public anger grew rapidly. The name Hoover became synonymous with failure and hardship. Shantytowns were mockingly called Hoovervilles. Newspapers used to keep warm were called Hoover blankets, and empty pockets were referred to as Hoover flags. One of the most dramatic moments of public unrest occurred in 1932, when thousands of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, demanding early payment of promised bonuses. When the government forcibly removed them using military force, the image of soldiers confronting veterans shocked the nation and further eroded trust in leadership. By the time Hoover left office, the economy was in ruins. Unemployment remained devastatingly high, banks continued to fail, and confidence was shattered. The Hoover era demonstrated a critical lesson of the Great Depression. In times of systemic collapse, an action can be as destructive as bad action. The government's failure to respond decisively did not just prolong the Depression. It deepened human suffering and reshaped public expectations forever. Americans no longer believed that markets alone could guarantee stability. A fundamental shift in economic thinking was about to begin. The Great Depression did not only destroy economies, it reshaped global politics and altered the course of history. As unemployment, poverty, and despair spread across nations, faith in democratic governments and free market capitalism weakened. People who had lost jobs, savings, and dignity began searching for strong leaders who promised stability, order, and national revival. This environment of fear and frustration became fertile ground for extremist ideologies, authoritarian regimes, and aggressive nationalism. Economic collapse created political consequences that would soon engulf the world in war. Nowhere was this more evident than in Germany. Still burdened by the aftermath of World War I and dependent on foreign loans, Germany was devastated when the Depression hit. Unemployment soared, businesses collapsed, and desperation spread rapidly. Democratic institutions appeared weak and ineffective, unable to provide relief or hope. In this climate, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to prominence by exploiting economic pain, blaming minorities and foreign powers, and promising to restore national pride through rearmament and expansion. The Great Depression did not create Nazism, but it gave it the opportunity to seize power. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. In Japan, economic hardship fueled militarism and expansionism, as leaders sought resources and markets abroad to revive the economy. In Italy, Benito Mussolini used the crisis to strengthen fascist control. Across the world, governments turned inward, embracing protectionism, nationalism, and military buildup. International cooperation collapsed, just as global trade had earlier. Economic desperation transformed political rivalries into open hostility. By the late 1930s, the world was no longer just recovering from an economic crisis, it was moving toward global conflict. Rearmament programs reduced unemployment and revived industries, especially in Germany and the United States. Ironically, it was preparation for war that finally pulled many economies out of the Depression. When World War II began in 1939, it marked the tragic conclusion of a decade in which economic collapse had reshaped global power, destroyed fragile democracies, and paved the way for the deadliest conflict in human history. The Great Depression proved that economic crises are never purely financial. They influence politics, social order, and global stability. When economies collapse and hope disappears, history shows that the consequences can extend far beyond borders, sometimes leading the world toward catastrophe. The Great Depression remains one of the most important events in modern history because its lessons are timeless. It revealed how fragile economic systems can be when built on speculation, inequality, and unchecked risk. It showed that markets are driven not just by numbers, but by human psychology, by fear, confidence, and trust. When that trust disappears, even the strongest economies can collapse with shocking speed. One of the most powerful lessons of the Great Depression is the importance of regulation and oversight. Unregulated banks, reckless lending, and speculative bubbles created a system destined to fail. The crisis demonstrated that governments cannot remain passive during systemic collapse. While excessive control can be dangerous, complete inaction can be catastrophic. The balance between free markets and responsible oversight became a defining principle of modern economics because of the Depression. Another key lesson is the human cost of economic failure. Behind every statistic were families torn apart, children forced into labor, and communities destroyed. The suffering of the 1930s led to the creation of social safety nets, labor protections, and financial safeguards designed to protect ordinary people from total ruin. Programs like deposit insurance, unemployment benefits, and Social Security were born from pain and remain essential pillars of modern society. Finally, the Great Depression reminds us that economic crises can reshape the world. They influence political systems, fuel extremism, and determine the course of history. The Depression did not just end with recovery. It changed how nations govern, how economies are managed, and how societies define responsibility and justice. Even today, echoes of the Great Depression guide policymakers during financial crises, reminding them what happens when warning signs are ignored. In understanding the Great Depression, we understand more than the past, we understand the present. Its story is a warning, a lesson, and a reminder that economic stability is never guaranteed. It must be protected, managed, and understood. Because when economies collapse, the consequences are never just financial, they are human, political, and global.